Welcome back, folks. For our final historical presentation today, we will turn to Professor Ron Mize of Oregon. And we will return with Professor Mize where Professor Anderson and Professor Ohm finished, which is the internment of Japanese Americans. Because when Japanese Americans left the internment camps, many of those camps were not destroyed. And in fact, several of those camps were repurposed as housing for Mexican-American guest workers, braceros. And these were men that were inspected, really like cattle, at the border, brought in to perform back-breaking agricultural labor. And in these camps, they were watched and tightly monitored to ensure that labor activists were not in their midst. So please welcome to Professor Mize to discuss workplace surveillance and the Bracero program.
So good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you for sticking around. I think we're now at the marathon point where we have no more breaks. I will do my best to be as active and engaging as possible. But first, I wanted to thank Alvaro for letting me know that I actually do surveillance work, which I really don't think I do. But understanding the surveillance implications of the work, I'm really happy to share with you all today, and all of you, Katie, Alvaro, the crew from Georgetown Privacy and Technology, thank you so much. And I will keep a close eye on time. So, okay. Just a little bit in terms of a background, if you're not familiar with the Bracero program, and then I'll talk about sort of where I'm going to go with it. The Bracero program began in 1942, connecting actually the soccer stadium, the National Soccer Stadium in Mexico City, with the fairgrounds of Stockton, California. That's where the first braceros were recruited from in Mexico City, and where their first job was in Stockton, California. The first group of braceros were sent to Stockton to work in the agricultural industry. It is a program that was designed as a wartime labor relief measure, but we all know that World War II ended in 1945, and the Bracero program doesn't end until 1964. A total of 4.5 million work contracts were signed over that time. Best estimates are about 2 million Mexican farm workers came to the United States during that 22-year period at the behest of U.S. agribusiness interests. During World War II, there was also a program that brought Mexican laborers temporarily to the railroad industry. You will find, looking at the program, I should say, because I always forget this, the work is coming from two books that came out in 2010. My book with Alicia Swords called Consuming Mexican Labor. The beginning of that talks about this era. And then I have a new book on the Bracero program called The Invisible Workers of the U.S.-Mexico Bracero Program, Obreros Olvidados, that just came out last year with Lexington Books. So thank you for reminding me to say that. So this is where all the material comes from today. Much of the experiences of the braceros, when you're looking at parallels, many of the parallels are in terms of sort of how the military operates in the United States. And so a lot of the military specifications that we see in terms of boot camps and things like that, you actually saw during the Bracero program. Lest we forget, though, these men were not soldiers. They were laborers that were hired to do a job, and what that means for everyone else in the workforce is that the number of hours that you give to an employer is the number of hours that you're getting remunerated for a wage. For braceros, every aspect, or nearly every aspect of their life was in fact public. There was no privacy in the ways in which the braceros operated. A very precondition of them being employed in the United States was a very public display of even their private parts. And so I'll explain what the inspection process was that braceros had to endure in order to become temporary workers. Okay. So in the process of what I'll talk about today, I'm going to cover the recruitment and the processing experiences of braceros. This is an image of a gentleman whose hands were being inspected. There was an assumption that there was an ideal worker that was coming from Mexico to work in agriculture in the United States. Part of that is that they would have experience working in agriculture. So the first thing that happens was an inspection of their hands. So if you had calluses on your hands, not our soft professor hands that we all have, but calluses, and it was clear that you had worked with farming implements, that was your first access point to be able to secure a contract. I'll also talk about the manner in which workplace surveillance operated. I will unfortunately probably cut a little bit of that short, but I'm going to try to cover that as quickly as possible. This is the type of surveillance that is very much old school. We're not talking technology and biomarkers. We're talking people watching other people, people using their authority to oppress others. This is very direct contact in the way in which the workplace was structured. And finally, we're going to talk about the housing and specific examples of the internment camp. I'll talk about two examples, one in Oregon and one in Washington. Many of the camps were in fact raised, so I'll flip that little narrative a little bit. Most of the camps were raised, and most of them were nowhere near any places where agricultural productivity could have happened. Hart Mountain, Poston, Manzanar were not places where you would ever find agriculture persisting, but specifically in the Pacific Northwest and also in Colorado to a certain point, you see the use of internment camps as abrazado labor camps. Okay, so that's what I will try to cover today in 8 minutes or 7 or however many I have left. All right. So there is a twofold process by which abrazados were able to secure a contract. In the first part of it, there was a series of recruitment centers that were developed. I mentioned the first one started in Mexico City. Eventually, that recruitment center moves a little bit farther north. The U.S. government constantly pushes that the recruitment centers would be close to the U.S.-Mexico border because that's where all of their processing centers were. The Mexican government wanted to keep the recruitment centers closest to the places where they deemed there was a surplus population, which was basically the large agricultural areas north of Mexico City on the sort of the Grand Plateau. And so in that sort of battle about where the recruitment centers would be placed, they were constantly moved within, not constantly, but they were moved within the Mexican side of the border. They were never moved on the U.S. side of the border. What happened is that these recruitment centers in Mexico basically became the way stations for those waiting for their numbers to be called. The streets became temporary homes for many who were not able to secure a contract. And what you see is that in this process of trying to secure a contract, abrazados were treated simply as numbers. And you see the numbers of the placards around their neck there. They were always handled in mass for everything from work experience inspections to health examinations to paperwork processing. Potential contractees from all regions of rural and urban Mexico were brought together for the common purpose of tending to the fields of U.S. growers. The waiting period was often the most difficult aspect for would-be abrazados because it was at their own great personal expense that they would have to wait in an unfamiliar city, often without housing or without jobs until their numbers were called. One of the men I spoke to, Don Jorge from Colima, spent 3 months living on the streets in Monterrey waiting for his number to be called. If they were lucky enough to get that number called, to receive that contract, their situation would suddenly sort of put them into a large mass of experiences and that every abrazado faced. The treatment that they received in the recruitment center in many ways served as a preparation for life beyond any individual worker's control. The images of how the abrazados were treated at the recruitment center are the evidence of their mass handling, which is the images on the far left-hand side. If they didn't feel like a number, the placards they wore around their neck certainly would remind them. Once they were able to secure sort of entry to the next stage, they ended up in the processing centers along the U.S.-Mexico border. And they were met immediately upon arrival with DDT. So this is the images on the left-hand side of the gentlemen that were sprayed with DDT. Not only their personal bodies, but all their belongings were sprayed with DDT with the assumption that this would kill insects, but it also, there's a whole series of assumptions that are going on to, going into this about Mexican bodies and the ways in which men would be sort of viewed as fit as U.S. laborers. Okay. I'm going to skip over self-sense. So I should say, as academics, we don't have the ability to talk in 10-minute spurts. It's 50 minutes. And so I know I've been cutting all day. I've been cutting more. But I'm failing in my cut. So I'm going to try again. So the images that I'm sharing with you today are really at the processing center. I want to use the words of Don Andres. who was a person that we spoke with in our research, because I think he describes the way in which this process unfolded. That very much at the end of the day was a process of dehumanization. A very precondition of securing a contract was the dehumanization of individuals. Don Andre states that, and I'm translating from his Spanish. He states that when we got to the processing center, they would pass us through and disrobe us, take our clothes off, and then they would pull our penis like that, and basically he sort of does an image where he's sort of pulling his penis back from the foreskin to check to see if we had gonorrhea or some infection, and then they would open your anus to see if you had hemorrhoids. And then the doctor would stick a finger to those who had a hernia, and if you had any of these, you would not go. You were immediately, you would not go. They would disrobe you completely, and then they would fumigate you. All of us who went were healthy, and the majority of us were young. Only the older people and those with the conditions, the medical conditions, were the ones that were turned away. And so all of this happened in mass. Individuals sitting in front of 300 other men, which is the image right there, naked, standing in front of each other, going through that medical examination was a precondition to secure work. It didn't get better when you got to the United States as well and secured your contract. So I want to talk a little bit about the workplace surveillance that they endured, and I'm going to skip a good portion of it. The aspect that I'm going to skip is really the class structure of how agricultural production happened and the roles of different, the roles that different individuals sort of occupied within that. The role of the farm labor contractor, the crew boss, and then the workers in the fields. All of that entire class structure was designed as a surveillance process, but I want to talk actually more today about what happens when people spoke up. What happened when they tried to resist? Because I think that's the story that we often lose in that. In 1944, a labor organizer and Columbia University PhD scholar Ernesto Galarza was basically touring bracero camps all across the Midwestern United States and partially in the West Coast. In 1944, he found that workers in Illinois, Colorado, New Mexico, Michigan, and California would rarely speak critically in the presence of camp managers or labor officials. Galarza continues this study 10 years later in the Salinas Valley and interviews 181 braceros. Of them, not a single one reports instances of intimidation in any form. But then he goes on and actually asks them a series of questions about wage theft, about deplorable working conditions, about deplorable living conditions, and being charged for basic implements of your job, like the carrot ties. They were actually charged for the carrot ties that they were putting on bundles of carrots. So clearly there was a whole process that was being experienced, but it would never be talked about or referred to in terms of intimidation. Quite simply, during the bracero program, the threat of returning a contractee to Mexico if he didn't meet the demands of the job without complaint was usually enough for workers to conform to grower expectations. If a worker didn't comply, deportation. If a worker caused a ruckus, deportation. If they started making demands for better working conditions, deportation. Living under the threat and fear of control, violence did not have to be inflicted by the grower because workers were made well aware of the history of state agents, primarily local law enforcement, who were recruited to do the dirty work of punishment. Quite simply, collective action was not an option afforded to the Mexican worker, pushed to the margins of existence. The power imbalance was so great, too often so great, that to begin seriously talking about leverage for the worker in negotiations was simply not possible. Okay. So, in order I apologize, I'm going to skip a little bit more about the workplace surveillance, but I want to move into the housing conditions as sort of the final way in which we talk about the bracero program, and this is where my fingers moving too fast will allow me to do that. Okay. There it is. When we look at the living conditions of Braceros, we found that it was very close to military specifications. Braceros were often housed in army barracks, complete with a mess hall that served institutionally prepared foods. The structure of the labor camps and other housing types were in line with the aim of social control and isolation, as the compounds were designed to physically separate the Braceros from the rest of society. And that's very much the image back here. This is out of Yuba City, California. The camp itself is that fenced area. The housing is the little piece above it. Other than the road, you see nothing but fields. That physical isolation was very much by design, and it operated for many Braceros working in sort of these large institutional camps. We find that there was basically three types of housing that Braceros were subjected to. The first was, as we mentioned a little bit before, specific Japanese internment camps that were in operation during World War II. It was really the camps that had been used prior to that time as work camps during the New Deal programs, sort of the Depression era working poor camps that were created, that were often leased by associations, growers, farm labor contractors, et cetera. And so most of that, those camps were in California. Important ones in Oregon and Washington. There's two sets of camps that were in Colorado. Two sets of camps that that overlap with the internment camps in Arizona, and a series of camps that were primarily housing West Indian workers in Florida. Okay. The specific example that I actually didn't uncover, Erasmo Gamboa, historian at University of Washington, talks specifically about Toppenosh, Washington, and the internment camp that operated in that particular state after World War II. And so what we see is this sort of supplication in the first form of workplace where internment camps, New Deal work camps became Bracero labor camps. And specifically, we see, and then the other two camps we see is sort of a series of makeshift housing, anything from tents to chicken coops to barns, you name it, whatever could be used. And the idea and the argument about this was that Braceros got the type of housing they deserved in comparison to what their housing in Mexico was like. And so you hear the language constantly used that the housing that they were being put into was better than the housing that they had in Mexico. Whether this was true or not was not the case. It was always the explanation that was used. So finally, I just want to sort of show you the map that we have from the Oregon State University Extension. Several extension agencies was where housing took place. Basically, about 18 different states housed Braceros. Oregon was the second largest after Idaho. And in these camps, what you see is the prisoner of war camps that are in Nissa, which is in far eastern Oregon, become Bracero camps. The migrant camps that you see as MC, which are basically the Bracero, the Mexican camps, is now today where you see the largest concentrations of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans living in Oregon. So wherever there's an MC, I can tell you that that's 30 to 40% Mexican today. The important way of thinking about the Bracero program is not only in terms of the demographic relevance to today, but the way in which workplace surveillance and inspections become the very basis for being able to secure a job as an immigrant in the United States. I thank you for your time.